The 1950s is often looked at as a time of peace and prosperity, with the end of World War II, the beginning of television, and the rise of rock and roll. But there was actually more crime in the 50s than any other decade before it. And on the night of March 6, 1959, the good people of Spokane, Washington learned that lesson the hard way when a 9-year-old girl was snatched off the street and brutally murdered while selling Campfire Girl cookies. The entire town came together to help find her killer, but with no witnesses, over the decades, the case slowly and quietly went cold. It was unsolved for over 60 years until modern-day genetic science linked carefully preserved DNA evidence back to one man. This is how one of the oldest cold cases in Washington state was finally solved in 2021. I'm Chris, and this is True Crime Recaps. Every week, my wife Amy and I are here bringing you all the crime in half the time. If that sounds good to you, I hope you'll give this a like and hit subscribe so you never miss a recap. Now, on with the story. Candy Rogers was a small for her age 4th grader. Since she was only 9, she was actually a bluebird. That's Campfire Girls for little kids. The day she disappeared was the first day of campfire cookie season. And on that Friday, the shy but friendly budding entrepreneur got out of school around 3:15. By 3:30, she was at her troop leader's house picking up her cookies on her way home. And she had big plans to sell them all that night. And if she did, she would earn a sales badge and be in the running for a free week of summer camp. But since she was so little, she could only carry 7 boxes, and neighbors remember seeing her walking home, juggling her school books with her cardboard carrier, holding the cookies. Over the next 30 minutes, Candy killed time waiting for the clock to strike 4, the official cookie sales starting time. Now, while she hung around, she ate an oatmeal cookie with her grandma, played with her dog Shep, and talked about the neighbors, or should I say the potential customers she was going to visit that afternoon. And sure enough, by 4 p.m., Candy was hard at work knocking on doors. In the Pacific Northwest in March, darkness falls around 5:40 p.m., and Candy knew she needed to be home before the streetlights came on. When 5:30 rolled around and she wasn't back, her grandparents started getting nervous. And Candy was their only grandchild. She lived next door with her mom, who was a high school history and PE teacher. Her father lived in Oregon and worked as a salesman. On March 6, 1959, her mother had a hair appointment, so she was late getting home. Imagine her shock and fear when she walked in and her daughter wasn't safe and sound with her grandparents. The group of adults split up and fanned out across the neighborhood looking for her. There was no shortage of people that thought they saw the little bluebird that night, but in actuality, there were lots and lots of Campfire Girls and bluebirds out hawking their wares trying to get that badge. It made it all the harder to trace her path, and then, all of a sudden, her path became shockingly clear. 5 hours after Candy set out to sell her cookies, she had disappeared, leaving behind a trail of 6 campfire mint boxes leading across a bridge away from her neighborhood. A massive citywide search was launched, the biggest in the city's history. More than 1,200 people showed up to help, and groups like the Marine Corps, Boy Scouts, utility workers, and mail carriers all sprang into action. But even the search party was marked with tragedy. As a helicopter was flying low, searching for the little girl in the Spokane River, it flew into high-voltage power lines and crashed into the water, killing 3 airmen on board. 16 days later, 2 hunters spotted a pair of little blue children's shoes lying near a tree off a lonely road west of town, about 200 yards from an abandoned rock quarry and 7 miles from her house. At daybreak the next morning, they found Candy's body covered with pine needles and tree branches. She'd been raped and strangled with a piece of cloth ripped off the slip she was wearing. Semen was left behind on her clothes. Another piece of her slip bound her ankles together, and there was a mark around her waist that looked like she might have been held with a rope, but nothing like it was found at the scene. Every piece of evidence was carefully preserved for the next 6 decades, waiting patiently for modern science to catch up and point the way to her killer. It was shocking how many sex predators were in the area when she was killed. The number one suspect for years was a man named Hugh Bion Morse. He was part of the Spokane Motorcycle Club, and he and the rest of the bikers were part of the search team looking for Candy. If you asked the other guys in the club about him, they would have described him as clean-cut, respectful, and friendly. What they didn't know was that Hugh was also a serial killer on his way to earning a place on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list. 4 years before Candy's murder, he'd been picked up in California for trying to molest 2 Girl Scouts selling cookies. In Spokane, he lived just a couple of blocks from Candy. Less than a year after her body was found, Hugh raped and beat 2 women to death in Spokane and tried to do the same to a third before he traveled to Georgia, Ohio, and Alabama, beating, raping, and stabbing 7 more women along the way. He was finally caught in Minnesota in 1961 after a neighbor saw his face on a wanted poster. Spokane detectives liked him for Candy's murder because he was known to love grape gum. Now, let me explain. At most of his crime scenes, grape gum was left behind. Why he couldn't keep it in his mouth, I don't know, but it was something of a calling card for him. So when detectives noticed something purple on Candy's clothes, something that smelled like grape, well, they figured it was his grape gum. And during the first few decades of the investigation, the grape gum angle took on a life of its own until it became one of the biggest leads in the case, pointing straight to serial killer Hugh Morse. He always said he didn't have anything to do with Candy's murder. Of course, he also admitted that if he did do it, he probably would have been too ashamed to talk about it. As it turned out, he wasn't lying. A DNA test in 2001 tested against the DNA found on Candy's clothes, took him off the list of suspects, and he died in prison in Minnesota 2 years later. Candy's murder seemed like it would never be solved. Luckily, technology caught up to this case. In 2021, the DNA was sent to a genealogy lab and results came back to 3 Spokane brothers, and eventually, with the help of one of their living daughters, they narrowed it down to one man, John Reigh Hoff. But shame had gotten to him faster than the cops did. In 1970, John shot himself in the head on the day his own daughter turned 9 years old, the same age Candy was when he raped and murdered her in 1959. And in a horrible twist of fate, he was buried in the same cemetery as Candy. He was 20 years old when he snatched the campfire girl off the street. His 10-year-old sister was Candy's big sister in Campfire Girls. That probably made it easy for him to get her into his car since she knew better than to take rides from strangers. But back in 1959, his name wasn't even on police radar. John had a troubled youth and went into the Army at age 17, but he didn't go far. He was stationed at Fairchild Air Force Base right outside Spokane, his hometown. While he was in the military in 1961, 2 years after killing Candy, he did 6 months behind bars for assaulting a woman in West Spokane, and that got him kicked out of the Army. After that, the Spokesman Review says he bounced from job to job. He sold knives door to door, he worked at Western Pine Lumber, and he put in some time at the Armour meatpacking plant. And besides the 6 months he did for assault, he didn't have a criminal record. And when he died, people thought he was just a decent man who had been depressed. No one knew who he really was until now. And that's your recap. Thank you for spending some time with me today. Amy and I are here with new recaps every week. Until next time, take care.